Can you hear me? Is that coming good? Thanks very much, John. I also wouldn't be in this closer. Yeah, thank you. Wouldn't be doing this if I hadn't become John's guinea pig, so thanks for getting me into all this. I'm actually going to talk a little less today about my own use case. By the way, just start going like this if I get too close to the microphone and, go like this if, yeah, closer? Okay, good. I'm going to talk a little bit less about my own use case than about the general problems of cleaning and enriching large collections that we are all going to confront as we start working with data on the scale that HTRC makes possible. And in particular, how can we share labor and how might HTRC help us share labor? So first of all, just people who contributed to the project. I'm from the English department at the University of Illinois. A couple of grad students have been working with me. From the library, English and Digital Humanities librarian Harriet Green. I think she may be here somewhere. You've met Loretta Oval from the Illinois Informatics Institute, and Boris Kapitanu is here too. So cleaning and enriching. I think the problems of cleaning data, we're sort of familiar with at least some of them, like OCR errors and that kind of thing. I'm going to try to go a little deeper than that and talk about kinds of structural problems we confront when we start working with digitized text on this scale. But I also want to draw some attention to problems or opportunities, if you will, in terms of enriching data. What are we going to want to add to what's available in HathiTrust? I'm a big fan of the leverage you can get from doing things at scale, and I'm a fan of HathiTrust data. But there are going to be things we want to normalize or things we want to add to the data before individual researchers will really be able to use it in interesting ways. So to the extent I can generalize about that, which is hard, I'm going to try to generalize. So in particular, enriching. What might we want to add? Clean is sort of clear, but what kinds of things would you want to add? I'm a literary scholar. I'm in an English department. So one of the things that interests me is genre. To some extent, that's available in a MARC record. Increasingly, the Library of Congress is providing guidance that it should be available, but it's often not really available. To some extent, you can infer it from call number, but not really. If you want to, delve, certainly not if you want to know, is this a science fiction novel? You can't always infer that from call number. What could you do with generic metadata? So here's one example. What I've done here is to graph the ratio between two word lists in 3 different genres over 2 centuries. So the individual data points are yearly values, not individual volumes, because we're dealing with 4,300 volumes and it'll be hard to look at them all. But yearly values of the ratio between 2 word lists in 3 different genres: poetry, prose fiction, and nonfiction prose. And the word lists, as it happens, are words that entered English before the 12th century and those that entered between the 12th and 17th century, which are interesting lists for reasons I won't go into for right now. It has a lot to do with the history of the English language, really, why those would be interesting. But what's interesting to me more broadly is that the ratio between those parts of the lexicon, their relative proportions in these different genres, change very dramatically over the period here and change in ways that challenge some of our received stories about English literature. So, at the beginning of this period, the earlier part of the lexicon and the later are being used essentially in the same proportions in poetry and in nonfiction prose. But by the end of the 19th century, 1899, poets are using the earlier part of the lexicon almost 3 times as often as books of nonfiction prose are. Now, this is excluding, I should say, stop words. It's excluding determiners, prepositions, and so on. Otherwise, the change would be less dramatic. But I'm interested mainly in content words here. Now, the reasons for that change are still sort of to be explored. I've got some speculations. But the thing I want to draw your attention to is this changes our story about poetic diction. Very commonly now, students are still taught that in the Romantic era, William Wordsworth came along somewhere around there and said, "Goodbye, artificial poetic diction. I want to reduce the space of separation betwixt metrical composition and prose," which in some sense he may have done. I mean, specialized orthography and some kinds of very specialized terms restricted to poetry probably did decline in the 19th century, and in that sense, artificial poetic diction may have declined. But the space of separation betwixt metrical composition and prose, in at least some important senses, did not decrease in the 19th century. So this is the kind of thing you can learn when you have volumes classified by genre. Obviously, that's metadata I had to add, and I'll talk in a moment about ways to add that at different scales. But just one more example first. Topic modeling is a valuable tool for a lot of purposes. I don't know if the colors, yeah, the colors are visible here. This is a model that I developed on about 2,000 volumes from 1750 to the end of the 19th century. And one of the advantages of having generic metadata is it just makes the topic more legible. So here I've plotted individual volumes where the x-axis is date and the y-axis is the prominence of this particular topic, whose words are listed over on the margin there, in that volume. But what I've also done is not plotted most of the volumes because the topic isn't very prominent in them. I've only plotted volumes where it's significantly prominent. And since the individual volumes are also color-coded by genre, what you can immediately see is that this topic is most prominent in books of poetry because that's the pinky purple color. And a little bit of fiction here, as it happens, Nathaniel Hawthorne mostly. And poetry in the early part of the 19th century, and actually, as it happens, especially poetry by women, if you dig down into what these volumes are. But that's visible when you have generic metadata. And then you can see some other topic is all blue and it's fiction very, very quickly. So okay, how do you get generic, how do you get genre? This collection I'm working with here actually is about 4,300 volumes that I've pulled together from various sources, TCP Echo, Brown Women Writers, and about 2,000 volumes that Jordan Sellers hand-selected in the 19th century. And we just coded by hand the generic metadata. But that's not going to work when I scale up and start using Hathi data, which I do want to do. This data was drawn from a bunch of different sources, but I want to use Hathi data for one thing because it's going to be more consistent. Data from different sources brings in all kinds of problems. And also because the first question people ask about results based on 4,000 volumes is, how do you know that's representative? And the truth, I think, is that there really is no one right answer to that. There are different ways of defining representativeness. Was this volume read widely? Is this a demographically diverse collection? Is it an inclusive, large collection? I want to have a bunch of different collections available so I can look at a thesis against all of those collections. So, that's where I turn to HathiTrust and where they're helping me out. And I now have about 800,000 volumes, English language, 18th and 19th century, serial and non-serial volumes that I want to use in the same way, but to do that I need to clean them up and add generic metadata. So what are the problems entailed in doing that? The problems of cleaning data actually I already had to encounter just with the smaller collection. So let's look at that, and then also I want to speculate a bit about how we could collaborate. Collaboration is necessary because it's a big problem. This is a sort of iceberg looming that confronts you when you try to work with data at scale, more than a few scores of books. And it's a problem where we particularly want to collaborate because the biggest part of the problem is not the nice, sexy part, in my opinion, of analyzing the data. Most of the labor, in my experience, is cleaning and enriching the underlying collection. And then the analysis is fun, but the looming task is cleaning the data. So what in particular is involved in that? Oh, first I want to, a little bit of a caveat here because I've used the term clean. I'm cleaning the data, but I'm conscious that I'm addressing an audience where many of you have much more training in library science than I do, and your standards of cleanliness are frankly higher than mine, and your goals are more long-term. You're thinking in terms of making things that will be usable for a very long period by a diverse audience. I want to do that too, but I also want to get my article published within a year or so. So standards of clean have to be relative. And also that's going to, as we see, that's going to vary from project to project. There are different kinds of goals that different kinds of analysis are going to require. So each project may have a different kind of balance between precision and recall. Basically, if I correct 100 OCR errors, I've improved recall. But if it turns out that 2 of those weren't errors and I miscorrected them, I've damaged the precision. For my purposes, that kind of 98 to 2 trade-off is worthwhile, but for other projects it might be different. It depends on, say, whether you're also wanting to do natural language processing so that one error propagates through the syntax and becomes a bunch of errors. So different projects are going to require different balance, and that is, I think, the limit on how much we can collaborate. There are going to be different needs, but my understanding of how this will work is we'll sort of create coalitions of the willing, of people who share similar needs, and then they can share similar resources. So what are the problems that I keep putting off addressing in terms of cleaning the data? The most obvious one is cleaning up the OCR. It may not be a huge problem for some kinds of analysis, a few errors in the optical character recognition. But before 1820, the errors are systematic enough that it's not safe to assume that they're randomly distributed. So before 1820, I think you really do want to clean it up. And once you do that, you kind of want to apply the same methods through the whole corpus. Also, identifying parts of the volume. If you're looking at a serial volume in the 19th century, that, it may mix fiction and nonfiction, poems in between them. So if you're interested in genre, obviously you're going to want to be able to separate out those articles. Or even if you're looking at a non-serial volume, very commonly poetry in the 19th century is surrounded by voluminous prose, introductions and notes. Again, you may want to be able to separate those volume parts. There's all kinds of text, as we know, the sort of notorious property of University of Michigan Library at the beginning of the digitized text, that ideally we'd want to find some way of removing that. Then there's things, I'm going to jump forward one slide, like what I'm calling a running header. The little text that appears at the top of every page. Basically what you discover as you're working with plain text on this scale is that people invented TEI for a reason, that all those aspects of page structure that get flattened in plain text, we often need to recognize them because we want to subtract parts of them or emphasize parts of them. If at the top of every page it says Life of Johnson, and then you topic model that volume, life is going to be distributed in a really surprising way through the whole volume. So you may want to remove those running headers. On the other hand, you may also find them useful to identify parts of, say, a serial volume, because they tend to change from article to article. And actually, that might be useful even in non-serial volumes to identify an introduction if it says that at the top of the page. So, okay, some kinds of cleaning we might want to do. I think I'm just going to, oops, I killed it. I killed it. No, I didn't. I think I'm just going to glance really briefly at this because this isn't really a talk about OCR, but what I'm saying here is that the correction rules one would use to correct OCR often depend on period-specific lexicons. That, for instance, APCS. In the 20th century, that's an acronym for Armored Personnel Carriers. In the 19th century, it may very often be an OCR error for apes. So your set of rules is going to depend on what century you're looking at. So again, we can share resources, but we're going to need to be thoughtful about the way we do that. There's some fun stuff about OCR implicit in here, things you can learn from a collection, like words that appear most commonly in dirty documents may be errors if you look at it at a collection level before you try to infer rules. But I'm going to skip over some of that. Okay, what about metadata? I've talked about cleaning data, but what about metadata? People who have training in library science will know better than I do about the problems of dating a document. There may be ways we can deal with that automatically on a large scale if we look for outliers in terms of the relationship between word frequency in the document and the supposed date. We may be able to identify some of those documents that say 1800 but really mean sometime in the 19th century. I suspect there are some automatic strategies we could develop. I learned actually just last night that this is called Ferberizing. Before that I thought it was something you did to babies. But duplicate volume IDs or editions that are all in some ways related as part of a single work. You may not always want to discard those, but you may want to be able to recognize them. And then, of course, adding metadata. Here's just a sort of a nod to Ben Schmidt's blog, Sapping Attention. If you're interested in the gender of authors, Ben has developed a clever way of inferring that from author name combined with census data. It won't be 100%, but it may be reliable enough to get you what you want. It's worth a look on his blog. I'm particularly interested as a literary scholar in genre, so I'm just going to glance at my initial stab at genre, just to sort of illuminate some of the problems and opportunities you run into. There are probably forms of classification better than naive Bayes to do this, but to start with, I'm just throwing some machine learning algorithms at word frequency in the volumes and seeing, how will a naive Bayes classifier do if we try to sort things into, say, drama, fiction, poetry, and so on. So the columns are what's really drama, and this is what did it identify as drama. And it does pretty well with nonfiction and fiction prose. 95% isn't great, but I think we can raise that with some tricks with using a bunch of different classifiers and so on. It does pretty badly with drama and poetry, but if you drill down into that, the reason for that is basically, here are the works that are really drama but are misclassified as poetry. They're all, in this case, poetic dramas. They're both. So what you need to recognize is that generic categories are not mutually exclusive. We need to allow them to overlap. And I think once we do that and gear things up a little bit more, I think it really will be possible to identify genre automatically on the scale that I'm looking at, 800,000 volumes. We'll also need to divide volumes into parts, because otherwise the prose introduction to a volume of poems will get mixed in with the verse. But I also think that's doable. And now I'm coming to my end. It's just a list of things I've looked at or glanced at along the way that we might be able to collaborate on collectively as a community of users, and some of them might reside at the HathiTrust Research Center. I think that's, in a way, where we store them is less important than identifying those coalitions of the willing, people who share similar kinds of research problems, similar domains, similar needs in terms of the balance between precision and recall. Once we have those coalitions of the willing, the rest of it is sort of straightforward. But I won't even, read through this list because I've already basically gone through it in my talk. And I think that's it. I wanted to leave some time for people to discuss things I may have overlooked in terms of problems we confront when we're trying to scale up. So I'm done.